see, ladies and gentlemen, that according to this announcement, I am to give you a lecture. I want to make it clear at the outset that I could not possibly give a lecture in 1 hour or 2 or 3 on Mozart. Such an operation, or an attempt at such an operation, would be not only incongruous but impossible. I should want a month for the task. Now, had I said such a thing 50 years ago, people would have roared with laughter. Nothing so remarkable has happened in my time in the world of music as the revaluation all over the earth of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. When I first entered the musical scene in London, which was not an unmusical place, as big towns go, I found that the public, as well as the press, was acquainted with 3 symphonies out of the 41 of Mozart, 2 pianoforte concertos, 2 or 3 sonatas for the pianoforte, 2 operas, very imperfectly, with a complete misunderstanding of their content and meaning. And that was about all. I have devoted a large part of my time since then toward the propaganda in the way of making a large portion of the music of this remarkable man known to the public everywhere. Now, things remain fairly static and stagnant for about 20 years. I played a great deal of the rest of the music. I played 9 or 10 symphonies. I played 8 or 9 piano concertos. I gave 6 or 7 of the operas without making very much impression. And then, suddenly, the wheel turned, and turned in the right direction. And people began to listen to Mozart with new ears. Now, there is no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, that a very strange attitude towards the music of Mozart grew up in the latter part of the 19th century. Thanks to the rise of the great orchestra, the super orchestra, discovered by Berlioz, developed by Wagner, and raised to the summit of the resonance, we'll call it, by Richard Strauss, the music of the earlier masters began to sound to ears unaccustomed to this richness of noise. The music of the earlier masters began to sound thin. Even Beethoven shared in a slight depreciation of value. I made up my mind, in spite of odds, to do what I could to alter this evaluation. And I came across, unexpectedly, some valuable allies. The most valuable of all was my late lamented friend Richard Strauss. I had known Massenet, who loved Mozart. I had known Saint-Saëns very well, who loved Mozart, and Humperdinck. And my father had known Gounod very well, who worshipped Mozart. And he'd known Dvorak and Brahms, and they loved Mozart. And they were all of a mind that this man was in some respects the most gifted musician the world had ever seen. So I puzzled my brains to know why, in the face of this general approbation of very distinguished musical minds, the public had been won over to a different conception of the fellow. Well, I found that Richard Strauss shared my view. that Mozart was so far from being a little composer, a pretty composer, a charming composer, probably the most widely gifted musician the world had ever seen. The man who had more moods in the way of expressing feeling, or I may say even ideas through music, more than anyone who lived before, who had lived since. And that the general attitude towards him was one of the mysteries of the age. I had the honor of producing for the first time in England the opera Così fan tutte, the first public performance of it. That was in 1910. It was only 120 years after the death of the composer. Rather a record for Great Britain. 120 years it took to get there. I believe it arrived here at an even later date. But I'm not quite sure about that, but I'm told it did. However, you mustn't accept my word for it. Well, since that time, thanks to Salzburg Festival, thanks to festivals everywhere, thanks to conductors who have some affinity with Mozart, and in my own country, to Glyndon, Mozart has become the fashion. 30 years ago, I could not have given a concert of Mozart and expected a full house. Now, if I give any sort of concert of Mozart, almost anywhere, the public will come. It's almost impossible now, under those altered conditions, to escape success. I'm not suggesting I want to. The most extraordinary manifestation of genius, precocious genius, the world has ever known, and the first great concerto was the one written for violin and viola when Mozart was again in his early 20s. It plays about 35 and a half to 36 minutes, and no subsequent composer has written anything so beautiful, anything so ingenious, or anything so skillful technically. Technically, I mean by technically the way the instruments, the two instruments, are contrasted or blended, and also masked by the orchestra. He was about 24 or 5 when he wrote that. He continued to write great works. And he wrote, although Haydn again wrote the first quartets, Mozart wrote the first masterpieces among the quartets. And again, he was the first to write, in his last 4 symphonies, the first 4 incontestably great symphonies. I say 4 because frequently people talk of 3. The last 3, in E flat, G minor, and C major, the Jupiter. To those really must be added another, the Prague, which, in my view, I state my view, is of equal merit. Now, I have used the expression "in my view," because, ladies and gentlemen, there is one thing I want to emphasize and make it very clear. I have a very great respect, indeed, and in certain instances, a great regard for those gentlemen who write about music in the press. It is a very difficult task, believe me. It is very difficult. I tell you why it's difficult. There is nothing fixed or certain about any performance of music. A symphony of Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, or Dvorak, or Mozart sounds different on one orchestra as to another. The same symphony conducted by one man sounds quite different, conducted by another man. Then the acoustic in the hall is very different. Somebody listening to a symphony in a certain hall may hear only half the sound and come to somewhat, shall we say, rash and impetuous judgment. He may sit somewhere else and he hears everything. Then, of course, the room may be too hot. Most rooms are in America. This one's getting a bit hot now. Or it may be too cold. So I cannot tell you how difficult the task is of any gentleman, however gifted, or how much consumed by goodwill, to go home after this trying experience and in cold blood write cool reason. Because there is no reason about music, really. It is sound, it's emotion, and no two men have ever felt the same thing about it since the world began. Now, I had something to say in an article I wrote in London a few months ago. And the title of this article, which was altered by the editor, was the immodesty of criticism. I was very polite to the critical fraternity because I number valued friends among many of them. People who write engagingly, sensibly, and have ideas to express. But there are too many people, here and there, who say this is, it is, they are, they have been. Nobody has any right to say that about any work of art or anything that happens. Because, as that dear old sage 2,600 or 700 years ago, Aristotle, pointed out, to use the third person denotes that there is a body of opinion, very large and sometimes universal, behind the use of the third person. In other words, if I say it is so, it means that I have the consent of the community to that statement. But if I say I think so, using the first person, it simply means that all I am uttering is an individual opinion. Now, you know, to my view, individual opinions are much more interesting than general statements. And therefore, I think if all the members of the press were to say, this is what I think, and I contend that what I think is right, and I don't care a rap about what anybody else thinks, that wins my admiration and approval, because that's what I say myself. All right. Well, now this is just a little diversion. Now then, we got on to this subject that I was speaking historically about the music of Mozart. I know all the operas of Handel, and I think I know most of the operas written between, let's say, 1700 and 1780 or 1800. And nothing can exceed my admiration for George Frederick Handel, who is one of the mighty men of music. Beethoven described him as the greatest of all and said that when he struck with the fire of the lightning. That is true. But his operas, one field, where are they? Like the snows of yesteryear. Mozart wrote the first really modern opera. Now, what I mean by modern, I mean an opera where the music, the characters, the story can appeal to you as they appeal to the public of 170 or 80 years ago, instantaneously and with enjoyment. The Enfuro, the seraglio, as it's sometimes called. The story is quite different to anything the public had heard before. There were no more classical heroes like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, you know. That went out of fashion. There were no mysterious enchantresses, you like Armida and Alcida, long ago forgotten. All very delightful people, no doubt, but not very interesting. In fact, there's a most extraordinary similarity between the lot of them. Like there is the advertisements, you know, of beautiful ladies at the present time. They're all beautiful, but they all look alike. Especially on the advertisement sheets. Yes. You had real people singing real emotions with sometimes tragedy, not often, tragedy, high seriousness at least, comedy, humor. All these ingredients, for the first time, were heard as written by a great master. Then we had what had never been done before. We had the first attempt to combine voices, combine all these characters. So they sang together, each preserving his or her personality. The finale of the second act of the Enfield, of the Seraglio, the way it is the first great attempt of Mozart to write this magnificent invention where all the characters sing together, by themselves, join in fact, a miraculous contribution to the technical as well as the aesthetic side of music. He followed that up with Figaro, Les Nozze de Figaro, which some people think is the best comic opera ever written. He followed that again up with Don Giovanni, which some people think is about the best serious opera ever written. And then we come to two very extraordinary pieces. We come to the Magic Flute. I expect you know every bar of it, I'm sure you do. There are about 23 or 24 numbers. And it's safe to say, and I don't think I'm unduly prejudiced here, that every single number is a gem. And I'd like to know where, in the whole kingdom of opera, one can say the same thing about any other work by any other composer. That is to say, where, from the first note to the last, is a continuing line of absolute mastery and complete inspiration, as you get in the Magic Flute. And another miracle, not his last miracle, but almost the last, is that extraordinary piece, Così fan tutte. This opera has perhaps an impossible story. I don't think it's really more impossible a story than that of the Magic Flute. If you read the libretto of the Magic Flute by itself, before you've heard the music, which you probably haven't done, but if you had done so, you would say it's quite impossible for anyone to set this to music. Impossible. Mozart did it. That's why I've used the word miracle. If you had read the story of Così fan tutte before you'd heard the music, you'd say the same thing. You'd say nobody would dream, nobody would dare to set such a thing. Mozart has done it. And he's accomplished another miracle. Every number is beautiful, striking, and extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. With certain novel features in it that did not appear in Figaro, Don Giovanni, or the Seraglio, or not even in the Magic Flute. Now that's one of the things which he accomplished. And the net result of all this, because I will be brief on this part of it, the net result is that today a dozen symphonies of his are played all the time, a dozen piano concertos, and nothing finer has ever been written, the piano concertos. They are his greatest works, where orchestras involved in the concert room. Violin concertos, concertos for all sorts of strange instruments, like bassoons and horns and that sort of thing. and you have masses and sonatas and heaven knows what. 650 works, all written within the space of 35 years. An ingenious friend of mine in Vienna, who had a turn for mathematics, set his mind to discovering how long Mozart worked every day, writing down only the notes of those compositions he wrote between the ages of 20 and 35. And it took him a long time to find out. And he discovered that Mozart must have written not less than 8 hours every day during the last 15 years of his life. 8 hours of writing. Therefore, the question arises, when did this fellow think? We know he wrote for hours and hours and hours every day for the last 15 years of his life. But he must have eaten, he must have drunk. In fact, we know he drank. I mean, in the normal sense of the word, ladies and gentlemen. And presumably he slept now and then. Now, there are one or two comments of a personal nature I'm going to make on Mozart. First, on certain characteristic features of his writing. People are under the impression that the music of Mozart is very easy and agreeable to sing. I want to tell you it's nothing of the sort. It's very difficult to sing, and sometimes it's very ungrateful to sing. Mozart, early in life, cultivated a curious eccentricity, and this eccentricity took the form of a fondness for amazing long leaps between one note and another. Quite an ordinary thing for him to make an instrument leap suddenly a tenth, up or down. It's very difficult music indeed to play and to sing. I don't know anything so difficult, because the fellow writes in such a way that every note counts. It's not like the music of my old friend Richard Strauss or even Frederick Delius, people like that. There are pages and pages in a work like the Heldenleben or the Alpine Symphony where you can, well, extract a few thousand notes. You know? Nobody will be much the wiser. You cannot do it on Mozart. One note played with the 19th violin, just a little off the key, provokes almost a resentment in the conductor, an uneasiness in the audience, and of course exasperation to the press.